On the 1st of November 2022, Contention Games launched the Kickstarter for Slay the Spire, the board game. And I'm not going to lie, I pretty immediately backed the full thing. My thought process was pretty sound. Slay the Spire is already essentially a board game, right? And a damn good one at that. They would have to actively make the game significantly worse in the translation to physical media for it to not be fun. Even if it did suck, at least I now own a full collection of Slay the Spire cards in real life, well, nearly, and, well, that's pretty cool. I'm also supporting independent creators. This is an indie company, after all, not some AAA, like, Dark Souls board game. Also, I have over 1,000 hours in the video game and have been beaten Ascension 20 on every character, so I was looking for a little bit of a shake-up to keep things fresh. And the current mods for Slay the Spire never really clicked with me. Looking at the board game, being able to play cooperatively with friends sounded great, and the actual designers of the video game are working on the board game. It really looked like a recipe for success, so I spent the money and waited eagerly for the roughly year and a half it took for the game to arrive. On Thursday the 25th of April 2024, I finally got my hands on it. I managed to find a slot of about 3 hours where I could get a couple people together immediately to play it. We only managed to finish Act 1 due to a lot of faffing around and learning the game, but it was good. One of the big concerns with any cooperative game is the balance between no player interaction and quarterbacking. But that clearly wasn't an issue here. We were all aware of the threats that each other were facing, and while we mostly focused on our own things, being able to help each other when we were in a dire spot was really engaging. Otherwise, it kind of just felt like the video game, but social. I went away that day craving more, and since then I have played quite a lot. To be clear on how much exactly, I've now beaten the game on the hardest difficulty, including the secret final boss, the heart, on every character. I've played the game at all player counts, majoritively single player, followed by a dozen or so two-player games, and only one act each of 3 and 4 players. Essentially, I feel I've played enough both of the board game and the video game to have a fairly well-informed opinion on the subject, although take anything I say about 3 and 4 players with a grain of salt. Playing Slay the Spire with physical cards immediately provides some advantages over playing with digital cards. For one, you can rearrange, organise and just mess with your hand in ways that make it easier for you to process the card you're holding, as opposed to the static order of cards in your hand in the video game. Sometimes I find it helpful to just place all my attack cards on the table in the order I want to play them before I actually play them, so I can quickly run through and see how much damage I'm dealing. This can be really helpful for avoiding misplays or other dumb mistakes. It can also be helpful to set aside the cards in your hand that you don't intend to play, so you can remove the clutter from your hand and see more clearly what your actual available plays are. Another thing is that you don't actually have to play the cards, which is a weird thing to say. But if you know how much damage you're dealing, or you know that you definitely have lethal in your hand, you just skip the part where you play them and just, kill the enemy. This can save little bits of time here and there, but the main time save is when you know that you will have lethal before you next take damage. There are a couple examples of this. One is you've got 2 rounds of poison ticking over, and you know that the poison will trigger before the enemy attacks and kill it. For a more extreme example, you have even more poison, or not quite enough poison to kill, but the enemy's not attacking next turn. So the enemy takes the poison damage, then takes the poison damage again and dies. And now you're saving yourself 2 full rounds of combat because you know you just guaranteed win. Sometimes as well, the odds aren't like 100% that you win, but they're so close to 100% that you just kind of want to skip the 3 or 4 turns that you've got coming up just to, do the fight. And that can save a lot of time as well and save some of the tedium of going through really easy fights repeatedly. This can also save you a bit of a headache if you're playing infinite combos. If you have an upgraded Flash of Steel and Finesse in your deck, you guarantee that you kill any enemy, but you mostly just have to sit there for ages playing card, doing little tiny chips of damage, but the enemy does eventually die. But in the board game you just go, right, I've got infinite, they're dead. And it saves you the 5 minutes of card playing that the video game forces you into, because obviously there's no way the video game can know you've got an infinite. I think as well, having real physical cards gives you a new perspective on how to play the game well. In the video game, every system is automated for you. Drawn cards appear straight in your hand, play cards immediately do their effects, shuffling your deck's near instant. Having everything automated for you is definitely helpful. It speeds up everything, and you can't forget anything. But this kind of just means that you play automatically. You don't think too hard about what your cards are doing, what your powers are helping you with, and things like this, because they just happen automatically. You don't need to think about them. But when you need to manually think about everything that's being applied, every effect that's triggering, you start to realize how much these things are helping you. You start to realize how important these cards and relics are for you, and you learn more about the game. And I think that's really interesting. This doesn't go for everyone though. Like, I am the kind of player that really enjoys learning the ins and outs of every game I play. I will play a game, if it really clicks with me, I will play it loads, I will go online, see what people are talking about, see tier lists, see rankings of cards, try and learn through that. But some people just don't have that. Some people just want to play a game casually, and for that, having to manually track everything is definitely a downside, but one that can't be avoided in a board game. The other thing though is that playing with physical cards is just a lot more casual an experience. I can just go into my dimly lit dining room, put some chill music in the background and just play some cards. Sometimes you need that break from sitting on your computer all day, especially if, like me, that's what you do for work as well. If you have some friends to share the experience with, it elevates it even more too. The other thing is that at the end of the day, you make the rules for the game. It doesn't follow the strict lines of code that the video game has to. If I make a major misplay and I just feel terrible, I'm like, God damn it, why did I do that? Well, I can just take it back. I can just go, whoops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Realize that I actually die if I play that card. Let's take that back. The video game is a lot more unforgiving. Coding an undo button into a video game is nasty. So Slay the Spire doesn't have one, and it's not really necessary. But having the option just helps elevate the casualness of the board game as opposed to the video game. And this comes back to learning as well. If you can take back every mistake you make, you're probably less likely to learn from it. But being forced into these misplays, you might learn a bit better how to play around them in future. But the other thing is, like, sometimes there are frustrations in the video game. Things like fighting Snake Plant again, or fighting Avocado again, or, that awful attack pattern that the boss got, or fighting Time Eater. It's like, I could just veto these. I could just say, I drew Time Eater, I kind of don't want to fight Time Eater right now because my deck's really fun to play, it's really powerful, but, Time Eater kind of screws it over, so I'm just going to fight the other bosses. And, like, yes, this does lose some of the strategy. Yes, this means that, you're losing the purity of your run. But it feels like having that as an option allows the game to be more about the fun of playing the game than about the fun of winning the game. And I am a lot more for the fun of playing than the fun of winning. I don't necessarily care about how pure my runs are. I don't necessarily care about, did I beat the heart flawlessly on the hardest difficulty without any helping hands at all. It's like sometimes I just kind of want to see if my deck can do it. I want to jump in here and say that I understand that developing your deck so that it can beat every enemy in the game is part of the strategy of Slay the Spire, and I understand that. But I also want to emphasize that I think Time Eater is a terribly designed boss. Now, my true belief is that a single-player game should not have enemies that fundamentally ruin your game plan. You can have things that, throw a spanner in the works and make you rethink how you are playing the game. But Time Eater showing up can just completely curb stomp your game. If you're playing a Shiv build in the video game, they fixed it for the board game, or you're playing the zero cost Defect or something like that, and Time Eater shows up, if you have not directly planned for this one enemy, which you may not even know exists yet because you're playing on Ascension 0, right, and it's your first game, you just lose the game, and that just doesn't feel fun. So I fully understand this idea that people would want to skip time meter, because hell, I do sometimes. When I'm trying to do a pure run, like when I say that I've beaten Ascension 20 on every character, and when I say that I've beaten A13 in the board game on every character, I didn't skip enemies for those runs because I wanted those to be legitimate so that I could use them as credentials, essentially. But when I just play the game for fun and I'm not trying to just win all the time, I will skip time meter half the time, though I will say that the board game does make time meter more interesting than in the video game. Anyway, rant over, back to the video. But on the subject of learning though, there have been a couple times where I thought my deck was really strong, a really, really good deck. And then I go into Act 2, I'm feeling all happy, and we get the Slaver fight, I'm like, cool. I can fight 3 Slavers with this deck, I can easily win. And then I just get rolled. And I just am sitting there like, that wasn't my fault. Surely that wasn't my fault. I just drew badly. I drew bad cards from my deck. The attack pattern was bad. I got vulnerable a lot, whatever. So I just go, you know what? Right. We're going to redo this fight. Not necessarily redo the run from here. I might still end the run, but I want to at least do this fight again, just to make sure that it is me that, or it is the RNG, not me, right? So I redo the fight, and I get rolled again. And then I look at my deck more closely, and I'm like, you know what? It is actually bad. There are reasons that I drew badly 2 games in a row. And my ability to replay this fight and see if I can do it better allowed me to understand that about my deck. And that's really interesting. And you can do that with a save and quit method in the video game, but it's like the game doesn't want you to do that, and you have to know that that's a thing that you can do, and it's a bit of a faff. In the board game, you can just play around with your deck however you like. You can play around with the game however you like. You can practice in whatever way you want. If you really struggle with one elite fight, well, just set up that elite fight, give yourself a deck and like a few card rewards, and just see if you can play around the fight. See if you can learn how to beat each part of the fight. The rulebook also shows a few daily modifiers you can try to shake up your runs. Some examples are having card rewards from all classes, or enemies dropping relics instead of cards, but you're not limited to these. You have this whole collection of cards and complete control over how to use them. You can just do whatever the fuck you want, right? Try a run where you start with no cards in your deck. Have an encounter be an elite, or every encounter be an elite or an event. Fight 2 encounters at a time. Fight double the enemies. Or fight all 10 bosses in a row in a giant boss rush. You can just do this because the game allows you to. It being a board game inherently makes it a sandbox. And that's like kind of awesome, right? And that's not even talking about the game. It's just the possibilities you can do with this box if you really enjoy the mechanics of Slay the Spire. You could even, if you really wanted, create your own ad hoc PvP mode in the game. And like, who knows? Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but you can try. What's kind of crazy is that nothing that I have just said that is positive about this game is to do with mechanics, to do with gameplay, to do with how it's designed. It's just, this is all coming from the fact that it is physical. You have the cards, you have complete control over it. It's all just away from a screen, sitting wherever you like in your room, so long as you have a table, of course. And this is great. Like, having Slay the Spire be a board game is inherently really nice if you really enjoy the video game. And that's not to say that there aren't downsides. I mean, having to manually do everything, as mentioned earlier, makes the game slow, but also just is quite slow, right? Like, playing the video game, I can easily get a game done in under an hour, like pretty much every time. But doing a board game run, you'd be very lucky if you can finish like even one act in under an hour. It takes a long time to play this game. And it takes longer the more players you have. Even though there's simultaneous play, there's a lot more discussion about who has what to do. And even if there wasn't, even if everyone was just playing their own essentially single player game against their own row of enemies, then it's the turn timer is now equal to the slowest of 4 players rather than the slowest of just 1 player. The game is slow, but it being slow doesn't feel as bad when, you know, you're sitting around a table with friends or you're actually holding the cards. It feels like playing the video game. You inherently get impatient. But there are a few things that get a bit tiresome. Rolling the dice every single round. You know, having to track all of the health and remembering to track your energy and your block and your... having to shuffle your discard pile every time. I'm lucky that I really enjoy shuffling. Some people don't enjoy shuffling so much, but you will be shuffling a lot in this game. A lot of shuffling. It's probably even more than your average deck builder, by a lot, actually. The other downside I briefly touched on earlier is that manually controlling everything means that sometimes you forget things. And sometimes this isn't so bad. It's like, oh yeah, no, sorry, I meant to take 1 damage there, I'll go back and take the damage. But sometimes you forget something that just inherently wins you a fight or makes a fight significantly easier. And there was nothing that you could do to undo it. I had a fight once where I just forgot to summon the cultists in the Awakened One fight, and I only realised when I got to turn 4, and I was like, oh, shit. You know, like, and then what do you do at that point? I can't summon in the cultists now, because by now they would have had loads of strength, and they would have dealt a lot of damage to me, and that kind of cheapened the victory of that fight. The only way to fix it is to roll back the entire fight and start again. And then I did another one where I forgot to fight the second Act 3 boss. At least I could, you know, go back and fight the second Act 3 boss, but it was after I beat the heart, and it's like, yeah, it devalued the victory, that's for sure. So these things do get better, though, as you play more. But they are things that are almost guaranteed to happen on your first 1, 2, 3 playthroughs. So if you don't mind that so much, if you can just take that in your stride and be like, oh yeah, whoops, we forgot that, oh well, then that's not so bad. But if you are really like a purist, you really want to know that you have beaten the game properly, then I don't think this game is necessarily for you unless you've got a really good memory. So, now we've talked about the inherent differences from the switch to a video game to a board game. But what changes actually are in here? What design changes have gone through? What balance changes? What have they mechanically done differently than the video game? Okay, so the first major difference you'll notice is the reduction in the size of numbers. A strike does 1 damage instead of 6, and a defend gives 1 block instead of 5. This is propagated across all the cards in the game. My take on this may be controversial, but I personally think that this design change is really good and probably better than doing 6 damage in a video game. I'm a huge proponent of small numbers in practically all games. The main benefit that you get is readability. In the video game, if I have 2 strikes and a twin strike in my hand and the enemy's on 33 health and it's vulnerable, meaning it takes plus 50% damage, do I have lethal? Well, I'll give you a second. The answer is no. Each strike does 9 damage, and 9 times 2 is 18. Twin strike does 5 times 2, which when vulnerable makes it 7 times 2, which is 14. 14 plus 18 is 32, and thus isn't lethal. Now, this isn't the hardest maths, but you would be forgiven for struggling with it. When making this puzzle, I actually had to go into the game and check if vulnerable rounded up or down, because I couldn't quite remember. And that's kind of part of an issue that this has. It's not readable. The only way you can find out whether vulnerable rounds up or down is targeting the enemy with your attack in your hand. And this does work, but having to remember these big numbers, having to remember, 9 plus 9 plus 12, not everyone can do that in their head. It's just like, whilst people who are really into these strategic number-based games, we might be okay with this, but not everyone is good at that. Like 12 plus 18 or 14 plus 18 is simple maths for me, but for someone who didn't do a maths degree, they might not be able to do that kind of thing easily and quickly in their head. But take the exact same situation in the board game. Now, instead of having to do 9 plus 9 plus 14, or 9 plus 9 plus 7 plus 7, instead we've got 1 plus 1 plus 4. And it's like, oh, that is just so much easier, right? That maths is just infinitely simpler. And it helps with people to be able to do this maths in their head. It makes it more accessible to people with dyslexia and dyscalculia. It's just good. It's more readable. It's more flexible. You can just look at your hand of cards and easily tell how much damage you have at a glance, rather than having to do, 18 plus 17 plus 23 plus 14. It's like, I don't know what that is on a glance, but if I see 2 plus 2 plus 4 plus 6, I'm like, cool, that's 14 damage. And like, it's easy. And like, what is the benefit of large numbers? Like, oh, I get more granularity, I guess. Sure, it opens up design spaces for relics and abilities and cards and things, right? So if I have, like, Vajra giving 1 strength, right, that is important, because 1 being the 6th of the damage of a strike is important, right? If a strike did 1 damage, Vajra giving 1 strength permanently would be fucking broken. And yes, it does reduce granularity. But granularity is not a bad thing to lose. In most cases. There are examples where it is a good thing to have lots of granularity, but in this case, you would instead just design the relics around the lack of granularity, instead of, designing it around the granularity that you have. You could, reducing a 6 to a 1 doesn't mean that, and now it's impossible to make relics for this game. No, it just means it's harder to come up with ideas for relics for the game because your design space is more limited. But you could still do relics. Like, while Vajra couldn't exist, you could create something else that replaces it. And make just as good a game, but now with an actual benefit of the lack of granularity and easier maths and things like that. But this isn't where the benefits of small numbers end. When you have small numbers, things are just inherently more tense, right? If I do 2 damage to an enemy, that's a lot. If I'm on 9 health, any point of damage is scary. If I take 5 damage in 1 turn, suddenly I'm like, that's half my health. It's exciting. It keeps things exciting. If I take 5 damage in the video game, I'm just like, yeah, whatever. Don't care. And you just take 1 damage. That's not a notable event. Take 2 damage. No one gives a shit. But in the board game, 1 damage, that's an important amount. That is a notable moment in the game, taking 1 damage. Every single time you take damage becomes a notable, memorable moment. Whenever you deal damage, it's a lot more impactful. It just creates drastic shifts in game states. It creates tense moments. And this does lead into one big shift in design from the video game to the board game, which is the intensity. In the video game, in Act 1, you will not find an enemy that does more than 20 damage. When your maximum health is 80, for the most characters, 70 for most characters, 20 damage is about a quarter of your health, which is a lot, but that is the absolute maximum, right? Like Hexaghost might do 20 damage or 24 damage or something, but Hexaghost is, and Slime Boss might do quite a lot, but after a big wind up and you can split him before that happens. And then you've got the 20 damage strikes from Guardian, which can be reduced, but those are all the final bosses, right? You might take 20 damage if you're vulnerable and a Gremlin Knob's attacking you, or you might take 20 damage on a high ascension if Gremlin Knob attacks you. And same with Lagavulin, right? These are the biggest possible hits you will take in Act 1 of the video game is a quarter of your health. In the board game, there is a possibility for the second encounter to have an attack that does more damage than your maximum health. And somehow this doesn't feel too bad. Like, okay, maybe this one instance feels a little bad. But there are ways of playing around it, and it creates this tense situation of, oh shit, if I don't kill this enemy right now, I die. It makes every fight a tense fight. Every fight could kill you. And that's fun. It means every fight is a lot more memorable, a lot more... It's less of a game about attrition and more a game about survival, more a game about every fight matters. And I really like that shift. The downside of this shift is that if you do die, you can't just reset with a click of a button. The video game makes death feel not so bad because you just click it, everything's reset, you start again in like 2 seconds. The board game, you've got to pack everything up, you've got to set everything up again, reset your decks, shuffle everything, do your Niao's thing, getting a card reward, figuring out everything else, dealing out the first encounter, setting it up. There's so much. So dying early can feel really bad because it takes so long to get going again. This problem is expounded in multiplayer, where one player can let the whole team down. If one player dies, everyone's got to restart the game. And of course that makes sense because you can't just have one player sitting out the fight. But it doesn't feel great if you've got a really strong deck, you're doing really well, and then your ally just ruins everything for all of you. But this is where the focus on team play comes in. You can't just focus on your own deck if someone else is struggling. You need to build cards that help them out as well. The other thing that's worth noting is Ascension 1 in the board game is not that difficult, or Ascension 0 is not that difficult. There is plenty of room for error. If you're playing with new players, you'll probably be okay, at the very least. What else has changed? Well, they've actually changed some of the cards. And I think these are some really good changes. Cards like Warcry and Barricade could easily have just made the one-to-one translation from the video game with no change in card text. But instead they receive buffs. Warcry draws an extra card. Barricade costs one less. These cards kind of underperform in the video game, so seeing these changes applied to the board game is kind of just lovely. Warcry is actually really good now, and taking it as a viable option, and Barricade is no longer a mostly dead card choice in decks that don't just generate crap loads of block already. On a similar note, Warpaint and Whetstone both now let you choose a card to upgrade, as well as upgrading a strike and defend respectively. This consistency feels good, especially when the strike and defend upgrades in the board game are quite significant. It doubles their power from 1 damage to 2 damage, and if you're not Defect, the defend upgrade is 1 block to 2 block to any player. It's better than doubled. And these kinds of changes just naturally make the game more enjoyable to play, increasing the variety of builds. And they should be applied to the video game as well. There are so many examples of this. I have actually, went and made some tier lists for all the cards that I think are actually better in the board game than the video game, and it is most of them. Just generally, the balance of the cards, the design is so much better in the board game. And the only ones that really fall into the better in the video game category are ones that just couldn't make the translation. But it does, there are some that were cut as well, but a lot of the missing cards just, they're not too bad. We're not too upset to lose Infernal Blade, for instance. Another big design shift was in the general removal of infinite combos. So cards like Turbo exhaust now, but they are buffed to compensate. So Turbo doesn't give a void, it gives a dazed. Cards like I'll get there. Concentrate, they exhaust, but now Concentrate lets you get more energy for the cards you discard, and lets you discard as many as you want rather than it having to be 3. It makes these cards fun and better and just more usable, despite the fact that they exhaust. And I like it. Infinites can be fun to pull off here and there, but they do kind of get stale, and in a multiplayer game you really don't want one person just doing the infinite that wins every encounter every time. And yeah, I'm really glad that they made this this change. So they also made these changes to some characters, most notably the Defect and the Watcher. So the Defect as a whole in the video game is generally the best strategy to just get focus, 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 frost orb, lots of focus, lots of frost orbs. You just kind of win from that because you block everything. It's kind of fun, but it definitely starts to feel one note after a while. Focus so heavily outclasses any other build that it makes anything else not really worth it at all. And similarly with infinite combos, focus can make you so incredibly powerful that you're not really playing the game anymore. You're just clicking end turn until the enemy dies. So focus was nerfed in the board game. And I don't know if it was intentional. The main culprit is defragment, which in the video game can give you up to 2 focus if you upgrade it, for 1 energy as a power. In the board game, 2 focus for 1 energy would obviously be fucking mental. When your lightning orbs dealing 1 damage is already double the damage that they do by default in the video game. Doubling that, even tripling that by gaining 2 focus would just be too absurd for 1 energy. So obviously they had to nerf it. It couldn't, because of the lack of granularity, they could not have focus exist in the way it does in the video game. So defragment got nerfed. But how it got nerfed is, in my opinion, what makes it really, really fucking good. It went from 1 energy to 3 energy, which is kind of the obvious change. They added ethereal so that it exhausts if you don't play it, which, yeah, makes sense. It's still a little too powerful, so, you know. Then they also made it rare. And that is the change that I think makes defragment really interesting. Because now not only is it weaker, because it's harder to play and exhaust if you don't play it, but also it's being weighed up against much, much stronger cards. You now need to decide if you want the defrag or if you want the fission. And that's quite a hard choice to make sometimes in some decks. The other thing is that they removed every other focus effectively. Like bias cognition, yeah, that's out of there. There's no way that was making it to the board game. And then they removed the card that loses an orb to gain a 2 focus. I don't remember what it was called. That's not in the game because it's much, much harder to gain orb slots in the board game than it is in the video game. In fact, there is only 1 card in the entire game and no relics that give you orb slots. So I'll get to that in a sec. So yeah, focus is so much harder to achieve. They did add a new focus card. It's static discharge. Makes your lightning orbs have focus. And there's one that makes your dark orbs deal more damage. But that's really it. It's a lot more niche. It's a lot harder to get. A lot harder to pull off. And it just makes Defect a lot less focused on focus, I guess. It means that the builds are entirely based around other things. Orb builds are still really good, but it's not everything anymore. I do think the inclusion of Capacitor, which gives orb slots, a weird one though. I don't agree with that making it over, because there are lots of cards that benefit from the number of orbs you currently have. Things like Lightning Storm, things like Barrage. These all benefit from the number of orbs you have. And now you can only have 3 orbs ever unless you get lucky enough to draw the only card in your deck. Your only card in your entire reward deck that can give you orb slots. Because there's no potion to give orb slots, that's gone. There's no relic to give orb slots, those are both gone. It is only Capacitor. And there's only one. And that seems weird to me with how important it is to get Capacitor in so many builds, that they have to balance these cards around the fact that you're not going to get Capacitor, because if they balance around them you getting Capacitor, then they're obviously going to be shit. But if they balance them around you not getting capacitor, when you do get capacitor, they're way too good. And I guess things being way too good isn't necessarily that bad, but when capacitor just breaks so many builds, I don't think it should have made the translation. I think that was a mistake. However, I do like the changes that they made to Defect as a whole, especially cards like Claw. Like, yes, we lose the Claw, and then this Claw they added as a sorry, I guess. But the default Claw is so much fun to use, and it's actually really strong. It's a better class now. And so is the Watcher. The Watcher 2 became much more balanced, though maybe not quite enough. If you're part of any Slay the Spire community, whether it be online or in person or whatever, you'll know that the Watcher is fucking busted, right? Like, just way too good. By far the best character, if you know how to play it. Yes, she's hard to learn, but when you learn her, she just fucks hard, right? So her primary mechanic is that she enters these stances: Calm, Wrath, Divinity, and Neutral, with all of them giving different bonuses. Calm gives energy when you leave. Neutral is the default stance, so no bonus. Wrath doubles your damage, but you take double damage back. And Divinity is very hard to achieve, but when you get into it, it triples your damage. It gives you 3 energy, but only lasts for 1 turn. The biggest problem here is Wrath. In your base deck as Watcher, you have one way of entering Wrath, and that is Eruption. Eruption's a 2 energy card, upgrades to cost 1 energy. This means that it's so easy to enter Wrath by default, and when you do way too much damage. Like a staggering amount of damage. There are so many ways of just one-shotting enemies in Wrath. You never need to leave Wrath because you just kill everything. That's not necessarily true, but, you know, it's so fucking strong. The character is almost like it's balanced around not having Wrath, and yet they also give you Wrath. It's silly. However, it has this weird downside of, like, you can't enter Wrath until you know you're killing something, because otherwise it will kill you back, right? Because you take double damage. But the only way to know if you're killing something is to do some maths. Yay! We've touched on this with the small numbers, but it gets worse when the numbers in your hand are doubled. Instead of adding 6 plus 6 plus 7 plus 10 plus 4, you're instead doing 12 plus 12 plus 20 plus 13 plus 18, and it's like, God, doing this maths is difficult. It takes brain power. You've got to hold a lot of information in your head, and it makes Watcher just kind of tedious. The same happens with Divinity as well, but worse, because now you've got to do 18 plus 18 plus 36 plus whatever. Like, if you can do all that in your head, great, but most people can't, and that makes Watcher kind of inherently unplayable for some people, because they cannot do that maths in their head. They have to just play Watcher on vibes, and if you're playing Watcher on vibes, you're going to lose like most of your games. In one turn as well, right? You'll enter Wrath at an inopportune moment because you didn't quite realise that you didn't kill, and then you just die instantly. And it just doesn't feel good. I don't think it's good.
Editor Abby here. Just thought I would mention a Watcher build that doesn't require any maths. So turns out that leaving Calm gives you 2 energy, right? Which means that if you have the card Rushdown, which allows you to draw cards every time you enter Wrath, and you have a 1-cost card that puts you in Wrath, which is in your starting deck, and a 1-cost card that enters Calm, which there are 2 of, you can go infinite so easily, and you can just play to get this infinite every game, and that avoids the maths. Great, but now you're playing this infinite combo every game, and some people like that. I don't like that. It is especially terrible designed for a multiplayer game, as mentioned earlier. Getting an infinite combo ruins the game, and if you get it every single game that you play as Watcher, that's shit. So yeah, back to the video.
So the board game changes it. And what I really appreciate is that the board game could have kept it identical. I played an entire run of the board game where I played with like Wrath from the video game, where I was dealing double damage and I was taking double damage. It works. You can do it. And in fact, it's not even that difficult with the maths because the small numbers, right? But they didn't. They changed it to +1 damage instead, which thank God makes the maths so much easier. Still, like adding 1 is so much easier than doubling no matter what number it is. It's just a much, much more balanced class because of it. And you take 1 damage at the end of your turn instead of taking double damage. So it's kind of a lot easier to negate the downside. But 1 damage on all your attacks is still double if your attacks are dealing 1 damage, like your baseline strikes or anything that hits multiple times for 1 damage. It makes Wrath better and more balanced, and especially in a multiplayer game, you don't want one player just killing everything. So reducing the damage of Wrath is still good, and it still feels incredibly powerful. They didn't change Calm at all, but Divinity completely fucking nuked. Gone. They replaced it with a new mechanic, which is Miracles. So Miracles are in the video game, but they're slightly different with how they work in the board game. So instead of being a card in your hand, they're now tokens. You can have a max of 5 of these tokens, and at any time on your turn, you can pop 1 to gain 1 energy. These things are fucking strong, and it's part of the reason why Watcher, in my opinion, is still by far the best character in the board game, because you've got Miracles. These things let you get far above 3 energy without an energy relic. There are so many cards that generate Miracles and do something else, and there are so many cards that deal stupid damage if you've got Miracles. There's 2 cards that deal stupid damage if you've got Miracles, and there's 1 card that gives you stupid block if you've got Miracles. And it just feels like having Miracles is really good, as well as using them. And it's just so much energy, so much flexibility. It's kind of like having Ice Cream baseline, and Ice Cream can be a really powerful relic. It's kind of silly. And they also kept the other Watcher mechanic, which is Scry, and they did not nerf it at all. And if you know Watcher... Okay, right. Little caveat, Scry is not great in Watcher in the video game, purely because the best strategy in the video game is to go infinite. And Scry doesn't always help you go infinite. In fact, it doesn't reliably help you go infinite enough. So generally you get like maybe 1 Scry card might help you go infinite, but for the most part you just make your deck like 5 cards and go infinite. Because Calm makes it so easy to do. And Rushdown. Rushdown also got nerfed, by the way. Great change. But Scrying's still in. And it's still as good as it was before. And it's still fucking busted. Like, cutting your deck down is so good. Everyone knows in deck builders, the smaller your deck, the more consistent it is. It is a good idea to have a small deck rather than a big deck, because you draw your cards that you want more consistently rather than cards you don't want. And Scry effectively cuts your deck down. You've got Cut Through Fate, which scries like 3 and then draws a card. You've got Third Eye, which just scries up to 5, which is fucking nonsense. And you've got the one that scries 3 at the start of every single turn. And it's like scrying 3 is worse than drawing 3, definitely. But it's not that much worse. When you are very limited to the energy that you have in your hand, and you can only really play 3 or 4 cards a turn anyway, unless you're going Miracles. Scrying just means that you cut out all the cards you weren't going to play this turn regardless. Like, I'm not going to play that Strike, I'm not going to play that Defend when I scry them, right? So you just cut those out, and it's effectively drawing cards. And a 1 energy card that means like next turn you draw 5 more cards. Well, it's obviously not the same. But, you know, it's broken. The comparison's not great, but it's broken. Scry is so good. So Watcher remains with these stupid cards that do stupid amounts of things, and by far the strongest class in the game. And yet somehow it is almost strictly worse than Watcher in the video game. So I guess that's the plus. So now I want to touch on Relics. And Relics is where I feel really let down by the board game, because they could have done so much better. One of the big things that Relics do in the board game is that they split them into kind of two types. You've got relics that are the same default relics as they always were in the video game, and now you've got die relics. So die relics are relics that trigger when you roll a certain result on the die. So at the start of every round of combat, you roll a die, whatever that result is, that determines enemy intents, determines all randomness for that round, effectively. It's quite a nice system, because it means you know all the randomness up front, you know how everything's going to go, other than obviously the randomness of the stacking of your deck and what you'll draw, but it determines a lot of randomness. The issue is they thought they would apply this to relics as well, and this falls apart instantly. So the reason, I am fairly certain the reason that they created these die relics is twofold. First, you now have a way of avoiding granularity, right? Vajra gives 1 strength, but Vajra in the board game gives 1 strength 1/6 of the time. Well, that's perfect, isn't it? That's great. The other thing is it means that their relics are easier to remember, right? You have a designated time to check your relics. You roll the die, you check your relics. Do any of them trigger? It's nice. It makes it easier to remember. You won't forget anything. The problem is randomness fucking sucks. Slay the Spire's relics, generally speaking, are not random. They trigger every 5 turns maybe, every 3 turns maybe, on turn 1 or turn 2 or turn 3. They might trigger when you do a certain thing, but they are not random, apart from a couple exceptions where the lowest case isn't even that bad. Talking Warpaint, Whetstone. The worst case is not that bad. It's still a strict upgrade to your deck. Stop crying that it upgraded 2 strikes. But the board game, just for some reason, decided that randomness is so important for this. And this really sucks for one major reason, which is that you can just die to the final boss because you didn't roll the result you needed. And that can be it. You need relics to win Slay the Spire, right? It is one of the hardest achievements to beat the game with no relics. Not rolling the result for any of your relics is the same as not having them. So, when you have randomness involved that can literally prevent your relics from ever triggering, you could just die on the result of those rolls. I fought the heart. I had relics that triggered on numbers 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6. I rolled a 3 rounds in a row, and I died. If any of those results were rolled, any of the other results, I would have been fine. And I'm still salty about it because it wasn't my fault. I rolled the dice. The dice screwed me over. And I had like rerolls. I had things, I rolled 3 3s in a row and it fucking sucks. And you can just lose to this. The thing that really gets me is, why do we need these? We have relics that would work. We have Gremlin Horn. Like, that would work. Unceasing Top. That would work. But the thing that really gets me, and this gets me about the cards as well, why does everything in this game have to come from the video game? Seriously, answer that question. Why does everything in this game have to be in the video game as well? Like, I can't think of an answer to this question. I legitimately cannot think of a single answer, aside from time saving and money saving. But that's not an excuse for a bad mechanic in a game. Time saving and money saving may be a legitimate production aspect, but when it makes your game worse, it is not something that is invalidated from critique. I just think it's conformity. I think they wanted this to be Slay the Spire's video game board game. They don't want it to be its own product. They don't want it to be, this is our board game that we made. They want it to be, no, this is Slay the Spire. This is the video game as a board game. There is nothing new here. It's all just the video game. But why? We could have so many cool relics, so many cool new cards. But instead it's like, oh, let's try and force anger to be still in the game. And, you know, let's try and force some of these cards that just don't work in the board game. But we're going to force them in because they were in the video game and we need to add all of the video game cards into the board game apart from like 5, and we've already removed the 5 ones that wouldn't work, so we've got to force these in somehow. Like, why? They've reworked some of the cards. They completely changed them. Some of them just don't work at all how they used to work, and yet for some reason they just gave them the name of a card that existed in the video game. Huh? Would anyone complain? Would anybody complain if there were relics in this board game that were not in the video game? I'll tell you what, they wouldn't, because there is a relic in this board game that is not in the video game, and that is Loaded Die, the starter relic you get if you are playing single player. And yes, I get it, it's a special relic, it's on its own, you don't get it in the relic pool. Why does that matter? I don't look at my relics with Loaded Die there and go, oh, that one looks out of place, apart from the fact that it's got a red background, right? If that had if Loaded Die had a blue background, it would just blend in with my other relics and I wouldn't think fucking twice about it. And I've got like 1,000 hours in the video game. You know, new things do look slightly out of place to me, but in a good way, because it's new content. But this game is just refusing new content. And I don't get it. They could have made the game better, and they didn't. The other thing I understand the criticism of, yes, but if every relic triggered on different things, you'd forget some of them. And maybe you would. Adding more opportunities to forget things, yeah, maybe you'd forget some of them. But I'd rather forget a relic than have it just never trigger from a die result. I'd rather forget a relic and then next turn go, oh, sorry, I should have done that relic last round. It probably would have done about 2 damage. I'm just going to do that now. Like, that's not that bad. And also the base difficulty is not hard enough that forgetting the occasional relic is going to make the difference. If you're playing on the hardest Ascension, yes, you've got to remember everything. But also if you're at that level, you probably will remember your relics. There are plenty of games that require you to remember far more. And that's fine. Nobody complains about that. Like, yes, I forget to put a dog on my pets in Terraforming Mars when I build a city. Sometimes I forget to do it. And maybe I lost a game because I didn't have enough dogs on there because I forgot to put a dog on there. But I don't care. I still played the card. I still remembered it enough. It still worked out, right? It is not that hard to remember 5 or 6 relics that you're going to get over the course of the game. You get far fewer relics in the board game than you do in the video game because the acts are smaller. There are less elites. There are less events. In fact, there are less chests. You can't get chests in question marks, and the acts 2 and 3 don't have a mid chest. You get less relics, fewer relics if you want to be pedantic. Now, I want to talk about a larger point with Slay the Spire, the board game, and that is, should it exist? Now, don't get me wrong, I'm really glad it does. Like, as I say, I've played this so much and I love it. And if anything, I kind of prefer it to the video game. I think it's kind of better. But my point is more that it doesn't do anything new. In fact, it goes as far as refusing to do much new at all. There's no new enemies, no new bosses, no new cards, no new relics, no new characters. Slay the Spire, the video game, was revolutionary. It completely changed people's perceptions of how a deck builder can play, to the point where the tag roguelike deck builder is almost becoming a cliche. The designs of the game are something they really wanted to show the world and have furthered the development of the genre. The issue with the board game is that it so stubbornly sticks to the content that it just doesn't offer that. I just can't help thinking how much better this could be if it had new things. If they removed die relics and added fun relics that maybe weren't in the video game, but are better suited to the board game. And this brings me to the point as well of like, this is nearly £100. If you want to play Slay the Spire, arguably, just for some people, the video game is just better. Play the video game. It costs like 15 quid or something. And you don't have to deal with some of the issues that this thing brings. And Slay the Spire, the video game, has more content than this. If you haven't played Slay the Spire, do not buy this. Unless you don't care for video games and want a board game. The only reason I would say to buy this over the video game is that it's physical media. That is it. Yes, it's better in a lot of ways, but it's not better enough. Now, Gary Doretsky, the CEO of Contention Games, who developed this game, did directly seek out the license for Slay the Spire. He really wanted to make this game, and that is great. When we have independent creators making things they want to make and making a shitload of money out of it, that's an ideal world. Like, that is what we want. My issue comes with this precedent that's being set that rather than making a new product, we should be making tie-ins to existing things because it's easier or they sell better. Media in general nowadays seems to be moving towards this trend that new things just aren't popular. Of the top 20 highest selling video games of 2023, only Starfield was an IP created that year. And no, Elden Ring does not count. It is essentially Dark Souls. But of the top 20 highest grossing films of 2023, 17 are sequels, reboots, or tie-ins to existing brands that are reliant on you knowing something about them already to make money. New and interesting stories like All of Us Strangers and Anatomy of a Fall end up with nearly 100 other films grossing higher. And don't get me wrong, those films still succeeded, right? I'm sure that the directors were very happy with how they performed, but we're setting a precedent where familiarity becomes the most important selling point. Now, it's no wonder that this is the way things are. If you're going to spend upwards of 40 quid or 90 quid in the case of Slay the Spire on a board game to enjoy with your friends or family, you want to know it's something you can enjoy, right? You see Slay the Spire, you see familiarity, you know Slay the Spire, you know it's good. It's safe. If you see things like Brass Birmingham or Spirit Island, like, I don't necessarily know what those things are, right? I don't know that they're going to be fun. You know what you're getting. I think the blame here lies on, well, capitalism, as much of a cop-out answer as that is. Board game adaptations of video games consistently sell well. If you own a successful video game IP, there's a very good chance you can make a good amount of profit creating a board game tie-in, no matter how mediocre. Minecraft, Terraria, Don't Starve, Worms, Dead Cells, Borderlands, The Witcher, Apex Legends, and Jetpack Joyride? The list of these games that shock me when I hear they have a board game goes on. And the vast majority of those that release end up with bad reviews. It's clear that the people behind these games are only making them because they realise they can make some money out of it. Like, be real. Do you really think that the developers of any of these games would make a board game if they didn't have an incredibly successful IP to tie it to? In fact, to prove it, find me a video game developer that has made a board game that isn't linked to their IP. It just doesn't happen. As soon as profit becomes the main motivating factor, the quality decreases. And for those board game adaptations with passion behind them, you're given this entirely new challenge of trying to force mechanics that realistically only work within a video game down into the physical medium. Games like Slay the Spire and Dorf Romantic completely, for the most part, sidestep this by just essentially being a digital board game from the get-go. Is it any wonder that those adaptations turned out well? The other issue is that video game developers aren't board game developers. They have a lot of overlap in design theory, granted, but Each medium has their own design philosophies that are unique to those mediums. There's a huge difference between playing games online with friends and playing them around a table with friends. There's a huge difference between playing a single-player game in a virtual space and sitting down at a table to play a physical game. If you've never studied board game design, you will have a hard time designing one, no matter how many video games you've designed. And the same goes vice versa. This puts board game adaptations into this weird place where either the developers of the video game try to make the board game and it leaves much to be desired, like Stardew Valley, or the developers of the video game pass on the IP to a third-party board game developer who doesn't understand the video game IP as well as the video game developer does, like Dark Souls. We then get into the issue with Kickstarter as a platform for pre-ordering board games. Many board game channels have already discussed this much more eloquently than I will do here, but the short of it is, be very, very careful backing games on Kickstarter, especially ones from existing IPs that try to lure out your money with that alone. Some examples right now, at the time of filming this, are the Terraria board game that launched with no gameplay video, no reviews from trusted reviewers, and somehow still made $2 million. Then you've got the Darkest Dungeon board game, which is by a notorious publisher, Mythic Games, who have had all kinds of controversies and issues in the past, and they made $5.5 million. When you see these figures, is it any wonder that all video games seem to be making board games now? To contrast this to the Slay the Spire board game Kickstarter, and another reason why I felt comfortable backing it, is that the Kickstarter page was honest. It had reviews from actual reviewers. It had gameplay videos. Hell, it had tabletop simulator files. You could play the game before backing it. What more do you need? No matter how good a Kickstarter campaign looks, you should still be careful before sending your money. Do some research on the publisher. And IP is a very powerful thing, and you need to make sure that you're not blinded by it. To sum up this discussion, we aren't short for wonderfully designed games and cool themes in our hobby. You just kind of need to find the right place to look, and that can be hard at times. Video game adaptations aren't going to take any of that away. I mean, good games are still going to exist. I mean, like, there are some really great games coming out this year. So, I don't think video game board games are taking anything out of our hobby. But, and if anything, they might add to the hobby. People who wouldn't otherwise play video games might pick up Slay the Spire, and they might love it. And they might realise that, hey, board games are actually good. As mentioned before, Slay the Spire is an excellent board game, and I would highly recommend it. But if you haven't played the video game to death like I have, you can get a very similar experience that is arguably better by paying a quarter of the price, probably less than a quarter of the price, online, and just play the video game. I think you will know if Slay the Spire, the board game, is for you. You will know if it's something you want to buy. But for me personally, I'm kind of done with the video game now, and I still crave games of the board game occasionally, so I'd recommend it.
Thank you for somehow getting to the end of this whole thing. I do really appreciate it. I do plan on making more videos like this on the kinds of board games that I have played, hundreds of times, because I really like in-depth reviews going really deep into mechanics. So if you'd love to see more stuff like that, well, my channel's tiny and you'll probably never see it again unless you subscribe. So, baby, do that. Thanks.